Our readers tonight are Claire Davis and Dennis Held. Our first reader is Dennis Held. Dennis grew up in Menominee, Wisconsin. Did I do it? Is that right? I did it phonetically. Menominee? Menominee? Menominee, okay. He attended the University of Wisconsin and graduated from Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, with a dual degree in journalism and creative writing. Before coming to the University of Montana, Dennis worked for a year as a freelance magazine and newspaper writer. He has published over 50 articles, short stories, and poems in a variety of periodicals. His awards include 2 first-place awards for journalism in the state of Wisconsin, a first place in Washington State's Fuller Poetry Contest, and last year he won the Academy of American Poets Prize at the University of Montana. Dennis is currently a candidate in the MFA program at the University of Montana. Please welcome Dennis Held.
That's a nice touch. I like that.
I didn't do that. First off, I'm really sick and can barely speak. So, deal with it, please. It's a heavy load to bear, I know. But when I was getting ready for tonight, I wanted to come up with something poignant and absolutely appropriate to the world situation to say, and realized after thinking about it that there is nothing fully appropriate I can say. So I'll content myself with trying to say as few inappropriate things as possible. And I think one good way to do that is to start by reading a Richard Hugo poem. I was going to just read the last line of this poem, and I read through it today and realized that I wanted to help make certain it goes on, and I wanted to read this poem out loud here in Missoula. Glenn Ewig. Believe in this couple this day who come to picnic in the fairy glen. They pay rain no matter, nor wind. They spread their picnic under a gale-stunted rowan. Believe they grew tired of giants and heroes, and know they believe in wise tiny creatures who live under the rocks. Believe these odd mounds, the geologic joke played by those wise tiny creatures far from the world's pitiful demands. Make money. Stay sane. Believe the couple now soaked to the skin sing their day as if dry, as if sheltered inside Castle Ewan. Be glad Castle Ewan's only a rock that looks like a castle. Be glad for no real king. These wise tiny creatures, you'd better believe, have lived through it all. The Viking occupation, clan torturing clan, the clearances, the World War II bomber gone down, a fiery boom on Bien Aedra. They saw it from here. They heard the sobs of last century's crofters trail off below, where every day the Conan sets out, determined for Ewig. They remember the Viking who wandered off course, under the hazelnut tree, hating aloud all he'd done. Some days dance in the bracken. Some days go out warm and wide on bad roads to collect the dispossessed and offer them homes. Some days celebrate addicts, sweet in their dreams, and hope to share with them a personal spectrum. The loch here's only a pond, the monster in it small as a wren. Believe the couple who have finished their picnic and make wet love in the grass, the wise tiny creatures cheering them on. Believe in milestones, the day you left home forever and the cold open way a world wouldn't let you come in. Believe you and I are that couple. Believe you and I sing tiny and wise and could, if we had to, eat stone and go on. I feel like I've been eating a lot of stone lately. So tonight I think I'm going to dedicate it to everyone to going on, which is what we need to do. I'm going to read a poem that I dedicate to Greg Pape, Learning from the Dead. Tim and I walk past a baby in a tall jar of tea-colored liquid, a precise oval of skin cut from chest to just below his navel, intestines coiled like a string of cartoon sausages. The professor lectures on the muscles of the shoulder, points to a life-size wall chart, like my mom's old medical book, with clear plastic plates of a man and a woman, side by side. I could peel them apart, page by page, lift the skin, the muscles, the internal organs, all the way down to the bones. Through a locked door, a long white room with 5 steel tanks on legs. Tim opens the hinged cover. This is Old Joe. A man floats face down in a clear fluid that stings my nose. His skin is gone, back muscles ribbed like gray corduroy. The students point with pencils, name the muscles, then turn him over. Stiff as if frozen, this Joe rolls with a quiet splash. His ears and nose are gone. In the only picture my dad has of the Korean War, he kneels, smiling, beer in hand. Behind him, long strings of human ears, the Turkish soldiers cut from Chinese corpses. That was a long time ago, is all my dad will say about the war. I wonder who could do this, strip a man of his skin, neatly trim his face away. A medical student, someone like Tim, someone I might know, or I could. I probably could. Here's a poem that started out to be a poem about me peeling potatoes. And halfway through the poem, it took the story away from me. And it's called Peeling. Her daughter's thin fingers pull the peeler slow, press the potatoes length in an unsure glide. At 13, only 2 years older than this young child, she had worked for wages, quit 6th grade to help out when her father left home again. She peeled for hours at Merrill Hills Club on a ridge over the marsh near Germantown, where they rented a house without enough rooms along the railroad tracks. In the restaurant basement, her back to the walk-in cooler, the peeler flew, long strips flicked with an easy slide into a kettle between her feet, gritty potatoes pulled from the burlap sack. Dust rose as she shifted, sneezed, then saw the man watching at the door, his face red and floating, surrounded by white. Her eyes ran from the dust, and she felt the terrible embrace of his stare. No, she remembers, he left then. That was the first time. She worked a month until her father came home and the house got small again. Still, at night, she sees the white bodies of potatoes, and her hands cramp from the ache. Here's a poem that started with one of those memories that seems to carry more weight than the drama of the moment would allow or encourage. And Bob Wrigley, when he was teaching here, encouraged me to follow it up and really kick it and see where it went. I don't know if I've kicked it as hard as Bob Wrigley would have me kick it. I think it would sail across the continent if you kick things as hard as Bob Wrigley would have you kick them. But this is a poem called First Blues. Nobody else seemed to mind when a big truck with a bell on the door hauled up and drilled my yard. "Stay clear, kid," the workman said. The hole grew down like an icicle. They slid a skinned pole in and packed dirt around. Tan ground opened up raw. One man rode up in a basket, pounded brown wire holders in, and ran lines back to the barn. The truck tires left wide ruts in our soft lawn. "Cut out your howling, Jesus, it's only a pole," my brother said. Later, it got hot outside, and I went alone and sat with my thin back pressed flat against the burning creosote and cried, not sure why, but already in love with the sliver of cold that cut through me, holding the pain next to the pleasure, keeping them distinct, separate, like me and the boy with his back to the splinters, like the pole and the hole it filled. I guess that was one of the first times when I saw my life sort of from the outside, which I think is probably a good thing to do when you're trying to make art later on. But here's another one of those. Purpose. A girl on a too-big bicycle looks back over her right shoulder, yanks the bike square into my Nova's grill going 25. She snaps up into the dangerous air, still in the center of the turning world, her hands held up as if to fight me off, face turned away. The thud of bone and flesh on glass. Her neck jerks, she slides up over the windshield, one bare leg and a tennis shoe, the last I see. She has become the girl who hurls toward me in my nightmares, and I am the faceless man in her bad dreams forever. I realize I'm stopped, put the car in park. 10 feet away, the girl lies perfectly still in the hopeless roadside dust, curled obscenely, one shoe off, looking as though I have thrown her there, hard. Shin cuts already glistening, nose crooked, broken and bleeding, not crying, not making a sound. "My bike! You ruined my bike!" She pushes to her feet, staggers 2 steps, falls into my arms. My absent hands catch her. Her shoulders twitch with sobs. I sit with her head on my lap, feel my mouth moving, comfort caught behind the cry I must hold back. Here is a young man holding a broken girl. A man sprints across his small lawn, stops at the fence, walks back to his house. I hear a siren, see kids running from huddles on driveways. The paramedics shine light in her pupils, rub her legs and arms and ribs for brakes. A woman runs screaming across the lot, "Katie, my God! Katie, oh my God!" The ambulance driver holds her back. "She's all right. She's going to be all right." They strap the girl onto a stretcher, pull away slowly with lights, no siren. McWanago cop measures my skid mark, 2 long fingers pointing toward my house. He says, "Follow me down to the station. Can you drive?" Writing it down, a storm in my hands, I try to get the words just right. All I can say is I hit her. The cop says, "Go home." I drive past the spot, 8 feet away from the curb, 2 blocks from my home. Kids on bikes point at my car. Enough cheery matters for a while. Let's get serious. I'm going to read a short piece of prose. It's about 6 pages long if anybody wants to count. Always when I see somebody reading a big stack, I start to look down at those last pages. I think you should have a counter, you know. What's my line? You flip one over. You'll have to count on your own, I'm afraid. It's 6 1/4. It's a piece that I originally wrote in a novel as a scene for the novel, And then the Milwaukee Journal was having a young writers contest, and I was no longer going to be a young writer anymore after this next deadline. So I just changed the names back to not protect anybody and sent it to him, and I went honorable mention that Charles Correll picked it. It was thoughtful. It was not a magazine article, which is what they were looking for. Holy Hill. I was 8 before I finally got to go to Holy Hill with Grandma. I was the 4th oldest kid, so it took a while for the really good trips to trickle down. Usually Saturday mornings meant catechism at Good Shepherd Church, but every spring Grandma would pull a couple of the grandchildren out and take them along to see Holy Hill. My brother Jim had been there once already, and he got to go again, which wasn't really fair, but at least it was finally my turn. Grandma pulled up in the huge brown Studebaker, wood blocks on the pedals, and 2 Sears catalogs to get her high enough to see through the steering wheel. Jim had been talking about Holy Hill all morning, and he was still going when we got in the car. "You just wait. They got all these big, huge statues of Jesus on the cross, and it's way up on this big, huge hill in this forest, and they got monks out there even, and..." "You hush, Jim." Grandma sounded mad enough to crack us with a knuckle. "There aren't any monks out there. Those are Carmelite fathers that say the masses. I don't want neither of you giggling or raising a ruckus when we get there. It's a holy place, and you best behave or I won't bring you back again." I slumped back in the seat. Quiet. I hadn't even seen this magical place, and already I couldn't come back. We were driving farther and farther out into the country. The rolling hills were laid out in long rows of mud and the foot-long stumps of last fall's corn. After we had driven a half hour, the hills were too steep to plow and were covered in bare trees. Some were capped by small graveyards, gray stones showing through tangles of berry vines. "Grandma, let's say the German alphabet," I said. I followed along in the parts I could remember, and we said the end out loud together. X, Ypsilon, Z. We rounded a curve, and there it was, Holy Hill, a giant brick cathedral with spires and a high bell tower that made it look like a castle from a fairy tale. I didn't need to be told to behave. I could barely breathe, much less talk. Jim was nodding his head, trying to act like he was used to seeing castles in the woods a half mile from home. But he kept sneaking looks as we drove up. Grandma pulled into the parking lot. There weren't many cars because it was Saturday, but there was room for at least 100. Grandma turned toward us, serious again. "Now remember, this is the house of the Lord, and you dasn't misbehave." Jim and I looked at each other, didn't say anything. When Grandma said you dasn't do something, she meant it. All at once, I wasn't looking forward to going in anymore. I was scared. What if I thought about something bad inside of God's house? I didn't quite believe what my catechism teacher said, that God was everywhere and knew everything about what you did. They said St. Peter kept track of it all, but I tried to imagine how fast he would have to write to get it all down. No way. I figured Peter was kind of like the brownies were for Santa Claus, checking in on what you were doing once in a while, especially around Christmas. I knew I did plenty of bad things in a year, but I always got presents. I figured the same way. I'd get into heaven okay if I was mostly good, and just bad once in a while. But once you were in God's house, I didn't think it was likely you could get away with anything. Grandma didn't have to worry. She went to church 3 times a week and prayed the rosary for everybody and saved the money she got from selling eggs to send to the missionaries in Africa and Montana. Jim was older, and he probably knew tricks to keep his mind from thinking bad things, but I wasn't sure about me. We walked up the path from the parking lot and climbed the dozen marble steps. I looked at the main chapel. It was bigger than Grandpa's barn, maybe twice as big, and all brick, with high spires on the corners, capped with blue-green metal. Above the big double doors, a stained glass wall showed Jesus leaving the ground. This was no small stained glass window like Good Shepherd had. This was bigger than any wall in our house, and Jesus was huge, his arms spread wide. We walked through the doors and into the chapel. I stopped. All along the walls, the 12 stations of the cross were shown in stained glass, 10 feet high. The church was filled, with a rich, mysterious light. It smelled like incense. Life-size statues of the saints stared down right at me from along the walls. A massive cross made of rough timbers, lashed with rope, hung behind the altar. 2 Carmelite brothers in brown hooded robes, belted with cords, lit candles with long brass poles with a cap for snuffing next to the wick. Grandma pulled me forward. We sat near the back, right on the aisle. Grandma made a sign of the cross and kneeled on the wooden kneelers, no pads. Jim and I kneeled too and moved our lips like Grandma. When she sat back, so did we. I turned and looked at the giant glass Jesus in the back of the church. All around him, the glass was a deep blue-black, but Jesus was almost clear, just a little pink, with dark brown hair and a beard. There were blood-red jewels in his hands and feet where the nails went in. I could see the places where the yellow crown of thorns dug into his head and left beads of blood. His feet were on a white cloud. You could tell he was on his way up. The priest appeared, wearing a long white robe, and started the Mass. I said some of his parts in Latin. I'd memorized the sounds, figured that was the language God talked. I caught Grandma watching me and thought I'd get hushed, but instead she smiled, nodded her head. After the short Mass, we passed a small side chapel filled with burning candles and a statue of Mary. All along one wall were the crutches left when Jesus made a miracle and helped a crippled person walk. Some of the crutches in front were just my size. I imagined being the poor crippled boy, throwing aside the crutches while all the adults watched, their eyes open wide in surprise. When we walked out of the church, I was blinded for a few seconds by the sunlight. I realized everything inside was so neat to look at, I didn't have time to think anything bad. I guessed maybe that's why they put in all the stained glass and statues and incense. Grandma led us to a path that wound through the trees along the side of the hill. A short way down stood a half dome, 15 feet high, made of rocks cemented together. Underneath were statues, just a little smaller than life-size, the Stations of the Cross, carved in stone. "This here's the grotto," my grandma said. "One man carved all these statues before he died. This is a holy place too, so you should be quiet." Grotto! I rolled that word around in my head. Grotto, 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 what a great word, grotto, grotto. I'm going to remember that one. There were 4 or 5 figures in each station. Jesus, sometimes Mary, but always a soldier or two. The Romans. Their jaws were set, their carved muscles bulged under their robes, and they all had swords made of stone. Jesus always looked off, seeming a little bored with the business of having his garments stripped, his hands and feet nailed, his thirst quenched with bile. He gazed out with stone eyes that made me wonder if it really even hurt him. Maybe he was part man, but he was still the Son of God, and if he could raise the dead and all that, he could probably make it so he didn't even feel the spikes as they were driven through his flesh by a heavy hammer. The mallet in the grotto was made out of stone like the people there. The man who carved them must have used a chisel and mallet. I wondered if his mallet was made of stone too. When we left Holy Hill that day, I felt a whole lot better about Jesus. When I was younger, just a little kid, I thought about how his mom and dad must have felt when they saw him on that cross. But seeing the calm look on his face, knowing that it really didn't hurt him at all, I figured he probably looked down at Mary and Joseph and winked to let them know he was all right. That early Catholic upbringing was a source of lots of fun words and sounds, a lot of words I didn't understand, but I still liked to say them, and I still knew the power that they had over people. And I think That sense of mystery and belief in power of words stayed with me. I thought lest I show my grandma to be more of a saint than she was. She was a farm woman, and she had a hard life, and she worked her ass off like most farm women do. And she had a hard side to her too. Cat disease. Grandma kept a squall of barn cats, half wild matted scratchers. She gave fresh milk and table scraps for gnawing down the barn mice. Every spring brought dozens of kittens, fuzzy and lots of fun when they got old enough to leave their beds of burlap bags in the back of the hayloft. But we knew enough not to get too attached, because all but a couple of kittens would fall victim to the cat disease. It tore through the farm, a mystery plague that claimed the lives of countless innocent newborns. Grandma agreed it sure was a shame. Sometimes God has a plan we just can't understand, she said, standing next to the bucket of water, the tight-fitting lid. Good old Grandma. Bless her heart. She knew how to do what had to be done. And this one sort of follows up on that essay and on that poem. Those Saturday masses were kind of a trial, and yet at times they were fun, because there were things there going on that I couldn't understand, but I could feel. And that seemed important somehow. Saving grace. When the choir leaned into Amazing Grace, the bass section billowed through first and hummed inside us, a deep-chested rumble from crew-cut ungles and gas station owners from town. Dark robes hitched and dipped from thrown-back shoulders. Sopranos in beehives behind the organ cut in the sweet part, the high and lonesome sound that shivered in under my skin, made me cold along my backbone. Amazing grace, how sweet's the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. I didn't quite get what genuflect meant, or why my grandmother rolled hard beads most night in her rocker, but I knew what I felt inside was holy, and was inside Grandma, the priest, and the old German farmers, stiff faces softened in song. I only knew the words to verse 1. When I had to read the rest from the hymnal, I drifted back out, separate again, until the first verse came back around at the end. I got my bad idea at school on Tuesday. Had to wait until Saturday Mass. Starched out in pinching shoes and pants that itched. Clip-on tie against the once-a-week white shirt, buttoned too high. Grandma drove, glad I'd asked special to come. Say 500 Hail Marys and I'll buy you a rosary of your own. I waited until we shuffled back from communion, the kneeling part. Grandma pressed her forehead against the golden wood of the pew before us, moving her lips in tiny winces. I slid the book with the right words into my pants and prayed myself, please God, don't let me get caught. Late at night, under the quilts with a flashlight lifted from the toolbox, I squinted every word in, mumbled them back out loud, then closed my eyes and said the remembered sounds. When we'd been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we'll have no less days to sing God's praise than when we'd first begun. I rode the Studebaker up front with new good posture, hymn book cinched at my waist. At the offertory, the wicker basket passed over my lap. I smiled at the usher, dropped a nickel. Grandma dipped into her coin purse. I slid the book out smooth behind me, and I was innocent. Communion time came. and I stood tall on the green vinyl kneelers and belted Amazing Grace straight out. Every word strung in order like rosary beads, precise, correct, and all grown up. But with everything clear in my head, I lost that feeling and knew the language God talked didn't use words. Then the choir sang through me again, and I felt the sounds, still there under the words. I sat back, rocked on the hard pew, wrapped in the blanket of rhythm and vowels, divine in the dialect of sound. Thanks. Two more. This first one I'll dedicate to Patricia Gotica. It was written in her fiction class in fall when I first got here, and I was having a hell of a time writing at all. Poetry class, rather. Thank you. You just got a raise, Patricia. You teach fiction now, too. They could stand some help. In numbers, mind you. Like I said, I'm going to try and say as few inappropriate things as possible. Thank you very much. I was trying to make some lemonade out of the lemons I was having at the time. And this is for Jim Crumley. You know, every town, I think, is inhabited by a spirit. And a spirit that makes you do things that you would otherwise not do. And after I was in Missoula for a couple of weeks, I kept feeling the urge to write a detective novel. Bob, any, I don't know where it comes from. It's a disease. So instead of that, I wrote this. It took a lot less time. And it's dedicated to Jim Crumley. The Case of the Unwritten Poem. I know you're out there. Thick-lidded eyes, hat pulled low and a smirk. I turn my head and you're still there, but I can't see you. Only feel your stare. I try the corner of my eye, scuff my feet, whistle a little. Of course, you never fall for such kid stuff tricks. Handcuffs make you laugh. Sometimes I think I've got a good hold of your lapels, then I blink and see the truth. Air. I've gathered your brothers by the dozens, half-breed bastards who share your features but are smoke inside, no flesh. I've chased you down hundreds of dead-end alleys, but always you give me the slip. Look, this shouldn't be so tough. I've read your description on post office posters for years. I know where you live. I just don't know how to get there. Truth to tell, I can scarcely contain my admiration as I tick off a list of your crimes. Assault with a deadly simile. Possession of assonance with intent to distribute. Felony irony. Repeat offender. I keep hoping I'll wake up one morning and there you'll be, asleep on my couch. I keep a pen and pad close by my bed, just in case. Last one. And this, Carol Kramer had a great reading last week, and she said that she thinks everybody should be allowed one divorce poem. Probably a good ratio, maybe a little high. And, you know, there are sort of standard poems that everybody has to write. So I thought I'd close on a standard. This is my love poem to a plastic bag. Kind of a genre thing, I know. Now I won't read it. Now you'll be really fucked up. No. Bag Dancer. Bag dancer, the seventh veil alive, you twist and writhe beside the songless Montana highway. Your gravel dancing pulls me over with the breathless chant of rhythm, rising delighted in diesel thermals. Jesus, can you shimmy, whirling in undulant, translucent swirls, your body swelled, a plush champagne grape, your soft belly round as a Rubens beauty. I gasp in the log truck fury that spills you upward again and again, filled with dust or indifference or possibly love. When it's almost too much, when I find my distant hand clasping the door latch, unbound to any yardarm, giving it over to the siren, a cab over Freightliner rolls by with a downshifted wink of smoke, double trailer wiggle, and you are gone for good, sucked into the impatient vacuum of longing, and I am alone, grinning like a fool, not quite full of regret. The highest grapes remain unplucked, but I am still a fox with a taste for sour. Amen.
Our second reader tonight is Claire Davis. She's a MA and MFA candidate in the program here, and she's got a fiction fellowship this quarter. She has attended Evergreen State University in Washington, where she had a foundation scholarship, and also attended the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. She's written 2 children's books called Pork and Bean and Max Maple, and she wrote and illustrated them. She was the editor of the Windy Hill Review for a year and has published short stories and poems in several journals. Windy Hill Review is one, Slightly West, Good Shepherd, Cooper Point Journal, the Wisconsin Magazine, State Magazine, American Lit Review, and several others. She told me she's a thoroughly Midwestern girl, and for 37 years never strayed more than 20 miles away from her home base of Milwaukee. She's the first one in her family to escape, and I'm glad she escaped here. Can you welcome Claire Davis?
Hello. This isn't half bad. I'm going to start out with reading a few poems. I'm one of those poetry fiction crossovers that the department loves so well because we screw all their numbers up. They don't really know how many people they have and what. So I'm going to start out with a few poems, and then I'm going to do a short story. First poem is called Chopsticks. Mama hated walking sticks, with a passion out of size to the small creature stalking the concrete slab floor. She beat them with a broomstick, fought wood with wood, stick splintering legs snapping off a debris of wood and life that I could not decipher as a child of 6. She could not tell me what it was about, only that she could not bring her wedge-heeled shoes down on them, as though they might graft to her soul. She gave respect to hornets, plum-bodied with sting, and from our hair, pinched spiders dropped ripe from the rafters overhead, let each go their way. Perhaps it was the deceit that Mama hated so. The stick bug pulling legs tight to its back of fake bark, seeming to be what it wasn't, a twig on the hard white glare of concrete. Mama beat her way across the cement, broomstick cracking as loud as my practice on the piano. She taught me, girls do not become concert pianists, they teach. At 46, my mother seemed petrified, her fingers crafted tight to the broomstick. I could not, in my soft-skinned years, imagine her hands, once supple like mine, fingering dreams in the dark behind her mother's back. This poem comes out of something I witnessed as a child. It does fiction, there's some fiction in it, but it came out of an incident where I saw a group of children battering in this immense old snapping turtle. It was one of the biggest things I'd seen, and they just beat it to death. It's called Soft Skinned. The children teeter down rocks in the creek, escaping the soft grunting of pigs and shovels canted on rails in the chicken yard, where a metal pail sweats in the dust. Water pecks bright on the calves of their legs. They shout down the throat of green-roofed creek, scoop water and drink the work gone. The tow-headed boy unearths the old monster, humped like a rock in the bed. Weeds bloom in ribbons from the soft undershell, its web feet flawed with old scars. It hisses a broth of creek and cracked marrow, stinking and ancient and black with secrets. Its hide is folded with leeches and crusted with snails. It churns the mud bottoms and pricks the tense surface to pluck duckling bones. With a stick the width of the girl's wrist, they lock the snapper's jaws. The snapper is barbed, slow-eyed and secret, like the straight-edged smile of the uncle. The boy hunches closer to see the wood wrist split in its jaws, then finds a branch, green and knotted. He strikes its head with the sureness of his father's squared mallet swinging broad on slope-faced cows. Blood fumes down the creek, startles trout, chub, and bass, layers bright on the eyes of a leopard frog. The snapper voids her clutch, eggs purling in the sand as the boy rides her rocky back, while the girl scoops an egg from the creek and splits the soft-skinned shell in her teeth. This one comes from my stay in Washington State in the Hoh rainforest, which is something you don't leave easily. It's called Light Rain. The Hoh rainforest storms light from the heights, frets and dribbles it down in a soft patter of leaf and lichen and moss, to be quenched in dark pools on the wood-black floor. Walking with my face turned up, I feel sunlight rain and drops splash red behind my eyelids. Find a fallen giant and walk the length of its life laid low, ended in a white-hot frenzy of lightning, now cooled to a soft green plate. I am an instant among ancients. My nails bore like soft-shelled beetles into the bark. I want to lay myself under the old skin, feed on the years, grow tumid in the deep green depths, feel time crust me in rings, slow as the fall of light from the canopy above. And my last poem. Brian, would you come up here a minute? Most of you know me. This is my son, Brian, and I just want you to take note. Enough said. Keeping watch. For the first time, my son looks down on me, the inches stealing over him in a hush of years. I stumbled into puberty. In a flow of blood, a sudden cramping of muscle, a stealthy shifting of flesh over hips and breasts, closely examined and vaguely feared in the mirror of my darkened bedroom. I remember the furious, quick heat from the smiles of young boys and restless, sheet-tangled nights pulled from sleep on the edge. I bound my fear in careful steps, hiding in groups that looked alike, talked alike, and felt alone. I gave over the green days of tar-soled bare feet and baseball seams split with the clean, hard stroke of my arms, to cradle musk nights and run wild-footed through the black grass, while my mother kept vigil, sleep-wrecked in the living room, her hands choked tight to the child she feared losing. My son steals on these bright terrors. I watch him with my mother's eyes. A short story. Trash. When John Root Pratt returned from the field, he called Tilly from her inventory of the root cellar shelves. She came up, out of the dark, blinking hands stretched out to steady her. When her eyes finally adjusted to the bright kitchen light, she made him sit down while she fretted at the stove. For he looked as Moses must have, coming down out of the mountain, his face wiped clean by grace. Early morning when John had left their home, it had been like any other day. He followed the tree line bordering the southmost pasture along the highway, walking under the poplars' wind-stripped branches, leaves thick on the ground and sweet with decay. It didn't matter that he hadn't worked his fields for nearly 2 years, parceling them out for hay or corn to neighbors now that he was retired. Still, they were his fields, in his keeping, and so he kept to them, with an eye on water levels and soil conditions. John loved autumn. It was the green of summer, well used and spent. It was a time to let the labor of summer account for itself. John squinted into the fragile sunlight, enjoying the crisp warmth on his clean-shaven face and the knowledge that all the good years, just as his father had promised, could only be an indication of God's favor. He loosened the wool scarf around his neck and walked the field's edge, along the side of the highway that intruded on his lands, bringing the city close in increments of useless lawns and golf courses. In the ditch, he came across a large plastic trash bag seamed with frost. "God damn," he said, looking down. "Can't keep their garbage home." He eased down into the ditch and lifted the bag. The plastic stretched, tore, and something slid out of it. Later, when asked by reporters what he'd done next, John would say, "I sat down." And that was all he remembered of those first moments. He sat down. Then he recalled a blue jay screaming in the trees, and a car, maybe two, going down the highway, and the rupture in the black plastic out of which spilled a man's severed leg, with its fuzz of soft blonde hair still curling tightly against the blue-white skin. He stared at the leg a long while, started to lift the bag again until something else hidden and deep in the plastic began to shift. He pulled his hand back. He pushed himself to his knees and stood up, looking down at his own squat legs in surprise, then turned away and walked back across the fields to his house. John sat across the kitchen table from their son, Carl, listening to the quiet clatter of dishes in the sink, as Tilly scoured cups stained by strong black coffee, sipped and discarded by the police earlier. Under those sounds, he could hear the snoring of Carl's pregnant wife asleep on the living room couch. Always been a dumping ground for Chicago trash, Carl said, and ground out a cigarette. A cup banged on the sideboard. Carl's voice dropped. Mobsters. Probably drug-related. John grunted softly. Tilly turned from the sink, wringing soap from her hands. "That's enough," she scolded. Carl looked down at his watch. Dad should be on the 11 o'clock news. And with his white shirt sleeves rolled up and necktie tucked into his shirt pocket, he walked stocking-footed into the living room. The TV clicked on. While John stood up from the table, crossed the kitchen and stepped out the door into the backyard. He stood in the cold and clapped his hands together, then shoved them into his pant pockets. John stood quietly, while moonlight congealed on the elderberry bushes and slanted off the remains of Carl's old play fort that John had found himself unwilling to convert into a tool shed in later years. He coughed to fill the moment and started walking away. The storm door banged shut behind him, and as he looked back, he saw Tilly come out onto the porch, pull a sweater over her shoulders, and step down into the yard after him. John led out through the orchard, his steps turning on fallen apples, bruised and slumping into the ground. He could hear Tilly following, out of the orchard, past the storage shed and the empty cow barn, through rows of field corn with the leaves clacking in the breeze, until he came out on the far northern field and stood on the solitary hill, his breath churning the chill air. Tilly stepped close and pressed a sweater over his shoulders. He looked south. "You see," he said, "from over there." His finger followed a pinpoint headlight moving down the highway. "Can you imagine? All the way here to put such a thing on my land." The sweater slipped from his shoulder. He felt her pull away, as she had earlier in the day when he had offered to take her out there, show her the bag, and the police with their dogs and shovels searching the fields. "No," she had said, and shoved him away, then turned away herself. He had felt hurt then, as though it was her place to see that with him, the years spent at his side having given him the right to expect it of her. She leaned into him now, but he felt separate, as if in some way he had left her behind. He looked into the night, wondering what else was hidden there, what else was unknown. She ducked her head and whispered, "Don't think about it," and snugged the sweater tight around him again. John turned to her. "How do I walk my fields again?" Tilly hugged her arms around herself. He asked, "Why? What did I do?" The next morning, a hard frost scabbed the few remaining squash in the garden. But by 10 o'clock, the clouds broke, the frost melted, and John found himself walking to the south field. Not first as he normally did, but last, as the thing worked up to. He'd started finding his way there since breakfast, where he sat longer than usual, drinking 2 cups of coffee, reading the newspaper, and leaving the questions he was most interested in for last. When he finally turned to the story of his discovery, he read each word, sat over the spread paper, and breathed through his nose. Carl might have been right, he said. Police think it had something to do with drugs and organized crime. Why do they think that? Tilly asked, buttering a slice of toast. John cleared his throat, then spoke each word as though he were counting change. His head and hands are missing. Tilly settled the butter knife onto her plate, glanced out the window. "Oh, my God," she said. John put the paper down. The police searched the fields and buildings. They would have found them. He spread both hands on the table, pushed his chair back. "I should go now." He hesitated. "You going to be all right?" he asked. "You want me to come along?" Tilly answered. And even though he left the house feeling better, it took him most of the morning to come to a full understanding of what he'd found. It was trash, like the styrofoam cartons from fast food joints or pop cans or a careless litter of kittens. He wondered what his father would have thought of it all. The rows of blank-faced houses with curbs and gutters, driveways and roads paving the land with concrete. But then his father had not known about such things. That was before the highway and the trash it spawned. John walked carefully over the plowed soil. He ran his hand through his thin hair and looked across to the highway where he'd found the bag. A car was parked on the side of the road. John walked faster. He could see a young man standing on the gravel shoulder. John started into a careful run. There were others in the car. John slowed as he approached the ditch. The man had a sweater tied in a bright yellow knot over his shoulders. His hair was burnished bright and red in the sunlight. His friends were laughing and opening the door for him. Another car passed slowly. John could see an arm pointing to him, to his fields. John stepped down into the ditch. He picked up a wad of paper and an old beer can and stuffed them into his pockets. He looked for more litter, then stood confused. The young man leaned out of the open window and laughed as hands from inside the car hauled on the yellow sweater. The car pulled away with gravel popping from the tires and the shouts of the bright young man trailing like exhaust. John watched the car until it winked out into a curve. He turned, facing the road that he knew wound through the rolling countryside, leveled out in the suburbs of Chicago, and was finally swallowed into the city itself. "Go ahead," he said, wiping his hands on his pants and looking up into the faultless blue of the sky. "You bring your garbage here." Frankie Altenberg's all-concertina band played every Friday night at the Elks Club. Although Tilly had often asked John to go, this was the first time he had suggested it to her. The idea had come to him while pulling off his work boots and white cotton socks, still clean after a full day. He looked down and saw his leg hairs curling dark and the blue veins rooting beneath the pale skin. He pulled at a hair, watched the skin pimple up beneath it, and snap back when released. And it was at that moment, with his eyes tearing slightly and his breath squeezed in his throat, that he thought of it. At the club, in the Bull Elk room, Frankie Altenberg sat in a wooden folding chair, center stage, his metal walker standing companionably beside him. The drummer brushed a slow shuffle on the snare drum, while his foot kept the one beat on the bass, and the hi-hat floated in the yellow stage light. The other concertina player sat to the right and slightly behind Frankie, squeezing rhythm and chords. As John and Tilly walked by, fellow Elks and neighbors nodded their heads and said, "A little dancing, hey, John?" and "How's by you?" They sat at a table near the three-piece band. Frankie played polkas and waltzes and limping two-steps. Tilly ordered a Manhattan. John drank highballs. In between songs, John would lean in toward Tilly as if to speak, only to fall silent. He wanted to explain how he had found himself here, to put into words the significance of finding his hair curling on his legs, and then somehow draw a connection from that to the brightly lit dance floor and old man Altenberg wheezing out a melody in a concertina, more relic than instrument. He knew it had something to do with finding your legs under you. By the end of 2 hours and 5 highballs, John let the explanation drift. He raised his face to the shine of stage lights, and as Frankie trailed out of a waltz and into a schottisch, John asked Tilly to dance. Tilly settled alongside him, and he rode his hand on her hip. Of all the dances, this was his favorite, with its practiced shuffling step and determined movement forward. His mother had taught him this dance as a child, humming the um-pa-pa bead under her breath, as his father watched, shaking his head at such nonsense. His father, dead these 30-some years, would take him to the fields instead, walk the land, tell him, "You put yourself down and stay. Then you see what God provides." He would open his arms, gathering in all the crops and years in one gesture. John felt himself stumble. Tilly kept dancing. He threw his head far back on his neck and shouted, "My father called me John Root." "Yes?" she asked. He circled the dance floor with Tilly, planting each step recklessly, his body bearing down as if to pack the earth beneath them. Each morning, John slowly chewed his food, then walked out to the fields with the same deliberation. Things seemed to be normal again, as though the sin in that bag had never been committed, or as if finding that bag had proved to be only a glancing blow after all. If he tended to go to sleep a little later or startle awake in the dead of night, he told himself it was no more unusual than when he'd worried for their crops or for their son in times of illness, till he watched him from the corner of her eye. 6 days after his discovery, he came back from the barber with the back of his neck looking frail, his ears crowned white. Tilly was packing squash into scalded jars, wringing the lids tight, lifting each jar to the light before immersing it in the hot bath. She nodded as John talked. "They stop talking when they see me." "Why ever?" Tilly asked, tightly packing the pale flesh into another jar. John paused, remembering how people pretended not to see him or ducked their heads. He spoke carefully. "It's like I'd told them some secret they don't want to hear about." Later that evening, in the car on their way to Edgar and Anna's for the weekly card game, John laughed for the first time since he'd found the bag. He felt his skin stretch. The 6 men sat around the dining room table, each one alternately sitting out a hand. They played 5-card stud, high and low, and aces and jokers wild, while Ernest always added a bump and a wiggle. They drank beer from amber bottles, waved their cigarettes, and spat small bits of tobacco from the tips of their tongues. After several hands were played in uncomfortable silence, John took a long pull at his beer, looked into the deep amber glass and asked, "What do you get when you mix beer cans and mobsters?" The men fell silent. "A Chicago landfill," he answered. The men laughed uneasily at first, then loosened up with Charlie's belly laugh. "They should all do each other in," Ben said, and the group looked to John. "Garbage," John nodded. He leaned over Charlie's hand. "More garbage," he said, his laughter lifting like a bark, and the talk swelled. John sat out the next hand. "Perhaps it mattered after all," he ventured. "If it was an accounting, just as his father had promised. If God had given him this, then John had looked deep, and he had not found himself wanting, only the world." Charlie excused himself from the table. Ben raised his voice over the general laughter. "Might have been sexual. Now they think the body was this guy been missing since Saturday." "Sexual?" Hank asked. Ben nodded. "As in homosexual." The room went silent. John set his cards down. Said he was canvassing in the suburbs for AIDS or something. "You calling?" Edgar asked John. Their voices lowered. A new hand was dealt. Bids were made. John sat silent, his eyes fixed on the cards. Edgar spoke up. "Well, it don't matter. Still garbage, ain't it, John?" "Still garbage," John said softly. Charlie entered the dining room from the kitchen. In his hands, he held a large, black, plastic trash bag. He walked over and dropped it on the table in front of John. "Must be for you," he said. John's face whitened as if slapped. He sat looking at the bag as Charlie turned away, laughing. "John," Tilly said, leaving her chair next to Anna, moving to his side. He looked up, and it was on his face, that look, like a soft echo of the other morning, silencing them. He glanced at Tilly, then down at the bag. Tilly moved her hand toward the bag, but John stopped her. "No," he whispered. Charlie stepped forward. "It's nothing," he said, "just a joke." He ripped into the bag, sandwiches scattered out. It didn't mean nothing. John wasn't certain he wanted to do this, or needed to. But after coming back from the card game, he had tried sitting in the cool light of the television, and then, in the heat of their bed, had tried to rub himself alive again, and failing that, to press himself limp into Tilly, until she had stopped him. He got up, dressed, and left the house. Tilly followed, stumbling in the dark. He reached out to steady her. The moon had set hours ago, and it was too early for the first gray of pre-dawn. He held her arm, his steps slowing. "I don't know if I can do this," she said. "I can't see." He led on. "I know this field," he said. He was certain he could steer them safely. "I'm sorry," Tilly said. "For tonight it was an ugly thing for Charlie to do." John sighed, his breath gelling the cold air. He listened to the hollow sound of his steps, judged the depth of frost at 6 inches. She tried again. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "No," he said. "You were right." They came to the creek that was skinned with ice. He could hear the water rustling beneath. "All these years," she said, "shouldn't I know how to help you?" He turned, following the creek away from the road. Tilly's fingers loosened on his arm. John paused, looked over his shoulder toward the highway. "Know what I did? Stood in that road and told God, 'Go ahead, bring me your garbage.'" He looked at Tilly, called him a son of a bitch, and dared him. John released a shaky laugh. "Thought he'd taken me up on it when Charlie walked in. Thought he'd sent me the goddamned head and hands." Tilly squeezed his arm. "I called it him garbage, Tilly, as if I hadn't seen." John Root Pratt looked down the creek to where it wandered in a lazy tangle through his field, washing the soil, moving into neighboring fields, past the homes of friends, beyond to where houses squatted in packs and dogs barked and ran the length of their chains. He stared into the distance to see beyond the blank-faced homes, to the people vaulted inside, shedding soiled clothes, lifting tired legs into beds and drowning the noise of the dogs, the highway, and their own slow dying in the muffle of quilts and the soft slap of flesh. And for a small moment, John thought he saw the 2 men, their bodies locked, the young muscled legs snagged around the other, the small curling hairs golden in sunlight, snuffed dark under the blankets.